Title: Gears of Dust and Blood Chapter 1. Shackles of Iron. The sun blazed down on a barren wasteland, the wind kicking up trails of dust across the lifeless expanse of rock and sand. In a world where the earth had long been ravaged by the undead and mankind fought to survive in scraps of a long-forgotten civilization, Jessie was caught in a web of steel and despair. At 18, she had known nothing but the harsh rust-colored landscapes of the frontier. She wiped the sweat from her brow as she finished saddling up her father's old steam-powered carriage, a relic from the time before. Patched together, with whatever parts they could scavenge, it was a miracle the thing still ran, sputtering and coughing every time she coaxed it to life. Her reflection caught in the brass of the engine panel, and she studied her own face, dark and fierce. Her braids were pulled tight, and her brown eyes flashed with a resolve she hardly felt. Her stepfather, Cyrus Rook, strode across the yard toward her, his face twisted with the permanent scowl of a man whose only talent was cruelty. The ranch behind them was a dying thing, much like everything else in this God-forsaken world. The cattle were sickly, plagued by rot that no one could heal, and the once productive ranch now barely scraped by. Cyrus was as desperate as he was ruthless. "I hope you've made yourself look decent, girl," he spat. "Barrow's coming to collect what's owed to him." Jessie's heart sank. She had heard about Barrow long before she'd ever laid eyes on him. A mutated half-neo-human, his genes twisted by the lingering radiation and toxic fogs that crept across the world's forgotten cities. They said he was more monster than man, but she knew better. The truly monstrous part of him wasn't his appearance, it was his obsession. Barrow had fixated on her ever since he had stumbled onto their land looking for trade, his warped face turning into something hideous when he caught sight of her. "Decent enough for your taste, Cyrus," she retorted bitterly, tightening the straps on the harnesses. He grabbed her arm hard, yanking her closer. "You keep your mouth shut and do as you're told, Jessie. Barrow's offering more than you're worth. More than this ranch can ever make again. You're going to be his wife, and that's final. If you try to run, you know what'll happen." She knew. The wastelands outside the ranch were crawling with zombies, ghouls that were always hungry. That, and Barrow's men, would be enough to hunt her down if she ever made a break for it. Her gaze shifted to the steam-powered revolver strapped to Cyrus' belt. Not that he'd ever let her use it. He'd rather she die than have a chance to defend herself. "Why don't you let me leave?" she whispered, voice trembling. "You could pay off Barrow in trade, anything but this." Cyrus sneered, leaning in close. "Your ma can't handle this place no more. She can't fight, can't earn. She's as useless as you, and this deal gets me out of debt. You belong to him now. Get used to it." Her stomach churned, but her defiance still burned. She wouldn't let Barrow take her. There had to be a way out. Chapter 2. Wheels of Destiny. That evening, the sky bled crimson as the sun sank into the horizon. Jessie was pacing in her small room, her bag half-packed with what little she could carry. Her mother, Rebecca, sat in the corner, staring blankly at a broken music box from the old world, her fingers twisting its crank, though no music came. "Don't cry, Mama," Jessie said, though her voice lacked warmth. "Cyrus says it'll be all right." Rebecca didn't respond, too caught up in her silence to be of any use. Jessie loved her, but years of abuse had turned her mother into an empty shell, her strength sapped by a life tied to a man who never saw her as anything but a tool. In that, Jessie shared her fate. Outside, a low rumble announced the arrival of Barrow's entourage. Jessie's breath hitched as she peered through the window. His caravan, a convoy of jury-rigged machines, steam-powered engines roaring beneath skeletal frames, pulled into the ranch, kicking up dust as they came to a stop. Men with cybernetic limbs and eyes glowing with a faint green hue guarded the vehicles, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas. And there, standing amidst them all, was Barrow. He was worse than she remembered. His body was a patchwork of steel and decaying flesh. His face was gaunt with pale skin stretched too tight over his skull, and his right arm was a twisted mechanical monstrosity, like the limb of a giant insect, its gears clicking with every movement. His eyes, though, were what scared her the most. They were too human, fixated on her with a ravenous hunger. "Cyrus," Barrow bellowed, his voice as grating as metal on metal. "I've come to claim what's mine." Jessie's heart raced. This was her last chance. She glanced at her mother, who still hadn't moved. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, before grabbing her bag. She slid out the window, landing silently on the ground. In the distance, Cyrus and Barrow were already talking, their voices low and conspiratorial. Jessie crept toward the barn, knowing she didn't have long. Inside, she found what she was looking for, her father's old motorbike, a relic from before he died. It ran on steam, just like everything else, but it was fast enough to maybe outrun the beasts Barrow kept on his leash. She knew how to work it. She'd spent years secretly fixing it up whenever Cyrus wasn't around. Jessie climbed onto the bike, her fingers trembling as she pressed the ignition. It roared to life, the sound of it too loud, too obvious. There was no turning back now. "Where do you think you're going?" The voice was low and dangerous, and Jessie froze. Barrow stood at the entrance to the barn, his metallic arm gleaming in the moonlight. "You think you can run from me, girl?" he sneered, stepping closer. "Your father sold you, body and soul. You belong to me now." Jessie swallowed, her hand tightening on the throttle. "I'll die before I let you have me." Barrow laughed, a horrible sound. That can be arranged. With a scream, Jessie gunned the bike forward, aiming for the narrow gap between Barrow and the door. He lunged, but she was faster, the bike tearing through the night as she sped away from the ranch. She didn't dare look back, but she knew Barrow wouldn't give up easily. Chapter 3. The chase. The wasteland stretched endlessly before her. An unforgiving landscape of jagged rocks and swirling dust storms. Jessie's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Barrow's convoy was already in pursuit, the rumble of their engines closing in. She had a head start, but it wouldn't last long. The bike coughed and sputtered as it bounced over the uneven terrain. She could see the dim glow of the city in the distance, a place where the remnants of humanity had gathered, building walls and barricades to keep out the horrors of the outside world. If she could make it there, she might be safe. A sharp whine cut through the air, and Jessie ducked instinctively as something whizzed past her head, smashing into a rock up ahead. She glanced back. One of Barrow's men had fired a steam rifle, its smoke trailing in the air. Her heart hammered in her chest. She swerved, cutting hard to the left, just as another shot rang out. The landscape shifted, the ground dropping away into a valley below. She raced down the slope, using the momentum to push her speed to its limit, the bike straining beneath her. The city walls were closer now, looming like a promise of salvation. But then she heard it, the unmistakable roar of something far worse than Barrow's men. Zombies. Drawn by the noise of the chase, they were emerging from the crevices, and crumbling ruins scattered across the land. Their decayed forms staggering toward her. Jessie's mind raced. She couldn't outrun them all, not with Barrow so close behind. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she veered toward an old factory on the outskirts of the city. It was abandoned, its machinery long since rusted into ruin, but it might provide enough cover for her to lose them. She skidded into the shadow of the building, jumping off the bike and running inside. The air was thick with dust, the stench of decay clinging to everything. Jessie ducked behind a pile of metal debris, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear them outside. Barrow's convoy had stopped, and his men were searching for her, their footsteps heavy on the factory floor. Jessie pressed herself against the cold metal, her pulse quickening. She had no weapon, no plan. All she had was her will to survive. Chapter 4. Rust and blood. The footsteps drew closer, and Jessie's breath caught in her throat. Barrow's voice echoed through the building, a low mechanical rasp. "You can't hide from me, girl. I'll find you wherever you run. There's no escape." Jessie's mind raced. The air felt heavy, the thick scent of rust and rot suffocating in the factory's dim light. Barrow's men were circling the space like vultures. Her muscles tensed as she crouched behind a massive hunk of broken machinery. She knew she had only moments before they found her, and her heart pounded like the pistons of the old world's machines, driven by a mixture of fear and defiance. She glanced at the scattered tools on the ground. Most of them were worthless, old, rusted beyond use, but her eyes caught the glint of a spanner with its jagged edges still sharp. Without thinking, she snatched it up, clutching it tight in her hand. The footsteps drew closer, accompanied by the telltale clank of Barrow's mechanical arm. His voice grated like metal scraping against stone. "You don't know how far I've gone to make sure you'd be mine, Jessie. How long I've waited. Do you think you can just slip away after all that?" Jessie's skin crawled at the sound of his obsession. She stayed silent, forcing herself to breathe as quietly as possible. The men were sweeping the building in a methodical pattern, getting closer with every step. She was running out of time. A shadow passed over her hiding place, and instinct took over. Jessie leapt from behind the machinery, swinging the spanner with all her strength. The man who had found her crumpled to the ground with a sickening thud, his skull cracking beneath the blow. She didn't wait to see if he was dead. She was already running. Barrow spotted her immediately, a grin spreading across his twisted face. "There you are." Jessie darted through the crumbling factory, her lungs burning as she weaved between rusted beams and crumbled walls. Behind her, Barrow's mechanical arm whirred as he charged after, his steps unnaturally fast for someone his size. She could hear his men shouting too, but she didn't dare look back. The exit loomed ahead, a faint sliver of light at the far end of the factory. She sprinted for it, her legs aching with the effort. Barrow was gaining on her, his heavy footfalls echoing closer and closer. Just as she reached the door, she felt the cold, sharp claws of his mechanical hands swipe at her back. Jessie cried out as the metal fingers scraped against her skin, tearing through her shirt. She stumbled, but managed to keep her feet beneath her, slamming through the factory door and into the night. Her vision blurred as the pain seared through her, but she forced herself to keep running. Ahead, the city's walls were lit by dim lanterns, and she could make out the silhouettes of guards patrolling the top. She was so close if she could just make it to the gates, but Barrow wasn't far behind. She could hear him, his voice dripping with anger and excitement. "You think they'll protect you? No one can save you from me, Jessie, no one." The last stretch of land between the factory and the city felt like an eternity, but Jessie pushed herself harder, ignoring the fire in her lungs and the sharp pain in her back. The gates were closing, slowly lowering as the guards prepared for the night, trying to keep out the zombies and the wasteland horrors. "Help," she screamed, her voice hoarse. "Let me in." One of the guards turned at the sound of her voice, his face twisting in confusion as he saw her sprinting toward them. "Open the gate," he shouted, waving frantically at his companions. "Let her through." The gate began to rise again, just enough for her to squeeze through. Jessie didn't hesitate. She threw herself under the steel barrier just as Barrow lunged for her again. His mechanical hand swiped at empty air, and he slammed into the gate with a roar of frustration. Jessie collapsed on the other side, gasping for breath as the guards quickly lowered the gate again, sealing Barrow outside. She could hear him pounding on the steel, his voice dripping with venom. "You can't stay in there forever, girl. I'll be waiting." The guards surrounded her, their weapons drawn. "You all right?" one of them asked, his face weathered and worn from a life spent fighting off the horrors of the wasteland. Jessie nodded weakly, though her body screamed in pain. She was safe for now, but she knew Barrow wouldn't give up easily. He had made her a prize, and in his twisted mind she was already his. "Get her to the med tent," another guard said, gesturing to two men who helped Jessie to her feet. She felt the blood soaking through the torn fabric of her shirt, but she refused to let herself collapse. She wouldn't show weakness now. As they led her away, Jessie glanced back at the gate, where Barrow's men were still pacing outside, their eyes locked on her through the bars. Barrow himself stood in the shadows, his face unreadable, but Jessie could feel the weight of his obsession pressing down on her like a chain. Chapter 5. Bitter solace inside the city. The air was different, thicker, but not with the same suffocating dread of the wasteland. The narrow streets were lit by gas lamps, and the buildings, though crumbling and patched together, offered a semblance of civilization. It was far from paradise, but it was a refuge. Jessie was led to a small clinic near the edge of town where a woman in her 40s, dressed in a mix of leather and cloth, tended to her wounds. The sting of antiseptic on her torn skin made Jessie wince, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out. She couldn't afford to show vulnerability. Not here. "You're lucky to be alive," the medic said, her voice flat but not unkind. "That man out there, Barrow, they say he doesn't let anyone go once he sets his sights on them." "I know," Jessie muttered, "but I'm not going back." The medic raised an eyebrow, glancing at Jessie's torn shirt and bruised arms. "You're brave. I'll give you that. But bravery doesn't keep you alive in a world like this." Jessie stared at her, the exhaustion settling into her bones. "What does, then?" The woman smirked slightly, dabbing another wound with a rag. "Cunning, and knowing when to fight and when to run." Jessie clenched her fists. Running wasn't an option anymore. She couldn't live her life constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for Barrow to strike. She needed to end this, one way or another. After her wounds were bandaged, Jessie made her way to the center of the city. The town was bustling with life. People bartering for food, weapons and scraps of technology from the old world. She caught snippets of conversation about raids on zombie-infested towns, steam-powered weapons, and the black market dealing in pre-apocalypse tech. This world was a patchwork of survival, and Jessie was just another thread in as night fell. She found a small corner of the city to rest, her back pressed against the cold stone of a building. The weight of everything crashed down on her, and for the first time since she'd escaped, tears slipped down her cheeks. She had fought so hard, but she knew this wasn't over. Barrow was still out there, waiting, and her stepfather. He had sold her like she was nothing, a means to an end. She thought of her mother, trapped in that lifeless ranch with a man who cared for nothing but power. Maybe one day Jessie could return for her. Maybe she could free her too. But for now she had to stay alive. Chapter 6. The final stand days passed, and the weight of Barrow's threat lingered. Jessie couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. She trained with the town guards, learning to wield a steam-powered rifle and practicing hand-to-hand combat. If Barrow came for her, she wouldn't go down without a fight. It wasn't long before the showdown came. One night, as the city lay quiet under a pale moon, the gates rattled violently. Jessie was on patrol when the alarms went up, and her heart sank. She knew it was him. Barrow stood outside, his army of mutants and raiders at his back, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. His voice boomed through the night air. "Jessie, come out, and no one has to die." The guards bristled, weapons ready, but Jessie stepped forward, her heart pounding. She had made a choice. She wouldn't run this time. "I'm here, Barrow," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her. The gate creaked open, and Jessie stepped through, her steam-powered rifle slung across her back. Barrow's eyes gleamed with triumph. But there was something else there too, something darker. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. Jessie didn't respond. She leveled her rifle at him, her finger hovering over the trigger. The battle that followed was a blur of chaos and fire. Barrow's men stormed the gates, but the city guards were ready. Jessie fought alongside them, her rifle kicking back with every shot. Barrow charged at her, his mechanical arm swinging like a scythe. She dodged, rolling beneath his strike, and fired around into his shoulder. The bullet tore through Barrow's shoulder, sending sparks and oil splattering from the joint of his mechanical arm. He roared in pain, the twisted amalgamation of metal and flesh jerking back as he stumbled. But it didn't stop him. Barrow was too far gone. driven by rage, obsession, and a thirst for power that eclipsed his own injuries. "You think you're better than me?" he snarled, his face contorting with fury. "You think you can just walk away?" Jessie didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her resolve was written in the way she stood, rifle steady, eyes locked on Barrow like he was nothing more than another obstacle she needed to clear. He rushed at her again, his mechanical arms swinging wide. This time she was ready. Jessie ducked low, the spanner she still carried clutched tightly in her free hand. She rolled under his attack, and one fluid motion swung the spanner into his exposed knee joint where the metal and bone connected. Barrow screamed, stumbling as his leg gave out, gears grinding and sparking. Jessie used the moment to her advantage, scrambling back to her feet and aiming her rifle directly at his chest. But before she could pull the trigger, Barrow's men surged forward, and she found herself surrounded. One of them, a brute with a cybernetic eye and steam-powered gauntlets, lunged at her. She fired, taking him down with a well-placed shot. But more were coming. They were everywhere, raiders, half-mutants, all drawn to the scent of blood and battle. The city guards were fighting fiercely, but they were outnumbered. Jessie's heart pounded as the chaos unfolded around her. She couldn't let it end like this, not after everything she had fought for. Barrow, still on his knees, glared at her with a mixture of hatred and twisted admiration. "I'll break you, Jessie," he growled. "One way or another, you'll be mine." Jessie tightened her grip on her rifle. "You're wrong." In that moment, time seemed to slow. She saw the path before her, Barrow, weakened and vulnerable, his men caught up in the chaos of the battle. If she hesitated, if she let fear take over, she knew he would keep coming for her. He would never stop. Jessie took a deep breath, her finger tightening on the trigger. A shot rang out. But it wasn't from her rifle. Barrow's body jerked as a bullet pierced through his skull, and his twisted, mutated form slumped to the ground. Jessie's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat as she spun around to see who had fired the shot. Standing atop the city walls, her steam-powered rifle still smoking, was Rebecca, Jessie's mother. Jessie stared, frozen in place. For so long she had thought her mother was broken beyond repair, lost in the haze of trauma and abuse. But now here she was, standing tall and defiant, having saved Jessie in the one moment she hadn't expected anyone to. Rebecca lowered the rifle, her face grim. But there was something else there, too. Something like pride. "I won't let anyone else take you from me," she said quietly. Tears stung Jessie's eyes, but she had no time to process the rush of emotions. The battle wasn't over. Barrow's men, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. Jessie seized the moment. "He's dead," she shouted, her voice rising above the din of combat. "It's over." For a heartbeat, the battlefield was silent. Then, one by one, Barrow's raiders began to retreat. Their will to fight broken now that their leader was gone. The city guards, emboldened by the shift, pressed their advantage, pushing the remaining attackers back into the wasteland. Jessie let out a shaky breath as the adrenaline began to wear off. The ground was littered with bodies, both human and otherwise, but the city had held. The battle was over. She looked back to where Barrow's body lay, the twisted mess of his mechanical limbs sparking in the dirt. He had terrorized her for so long, cast a shadow over her life. Now he was just another corpse in a world full of death. Rebecca descended from the wall and approached Jessie, her expression softening as she neared her daughter. Jessie wiped the tears from her face, swallowing the lump in her throat as she looked up at her mother. "I didn't think you'd," Jessie began, her voice breaking. Rebecca cut her off with a soft but firm shake of her head. "I should have done this a long time ago. I should have protected you." Jessie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her mother, holding her tight. For the first time in what felt like years, she felt safe. Chapter 7. A new dawn. The sun was rising over the wasteland, casting long shadows across the city as Jessie stood on the wall, looking out at the barren expanse. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke and blood, but the sky was a soft muted pink, a reminder that even in the harshest places there could be beauty. Jessie knew this wasn't the end. The world was still dangerous, filled with ghouls, raiders, and all manner of horrors, but for the first time in her life she felt like she had a future that was hers to shape. Rebecca stood beside her, silent but present. They hadn't spoken much since the battle ended. There was still too much unsaid, too much history between them. But there was time now, time to rebuild, time to heal. "What happens now?" Jessie asked quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon. Rebecca sighed, her hands resting on the weathered stone of the wall. "We survive. We keep moving forward, one day at a time." Jessie nodded, her gaze drifting to the distant mountains. The promise of a world beyond the wasteland. There was still so much she didn't know. Still so much she had to learn about herself and the world around her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had fought for her freedom, fought for her life. And she had WN'd at as the first rays of sunlight warmed her face. Jessie smiled. It wasn't a victory without cost, and there would be scars both physical and emotional that would take time to heal. But in this moment, standing beside her mother, she felt something bittersweet bloom inside her. Hope the wasteland might have been a cruel place, but Jessie was no longer its prisoner. She was its conqueror, and the future was hers to claim. The end.